Hello, I'm Robert, fact checker and science blogger, and helping people who are scared of many things. And welcome to my channel. So this time it's about the UK variant, and this evidence that apparently it's not very strong evidence that it might be slightly more deadly, which is scaring some people. So the experts find the evidence is quite weak so far, because there could be many other reasons for the variation. So I'll have a look at the evidence in a minute. But first of all, to say that what the good news is that we, as they said in the World Health Organization, we have good evidence now that the methods we have to stop the transmission still work. All these methods in UK and South Africa, physical distancing, mask wearing, and sport isolation and quarantine, contact tracing, and the vaccination is coming along now as well. All of this does still work with the new variants. And the cases per day are going down in the United Kingdom and in South Africa, which shows that we can stop it in the same way as we stopped all the other variants. We can stop transmission, keep on breaking transmission. The R0 is less than 1 for the United Kingdom, and I think it's 0.8 to 1 at the moment. Anyway, once the R0, which is the number of people that one person can infect, if each person on average infects less than one person, then the cases per day will go down. And they will keep going down and down and down. If you keep it up like that, eventually there's nowhere for the virus to go. It's mathematically impossible for it to go up again for as long as the R0 stays below 1. And the United Kingdom got all the way down to very few cases per million last summer, and then they let up. And that's why we are where we are now. If they had kept going, even though they're doing a very expensive method of a lockdown, but a few extra weeks of lockdown would have eliminated it. And then we wouldn't have had this second lockdown. And then we could have been like New Zealand and stopped all cases coming into the United Kingdom. Like China, like many other countries. So once the R0 is below 1, you can get rid of it. It's mathematics, pure mathematics. It can't come up again as long as you keep it below 1. And we can still do that with the new variant. So the news is exactly the same as before. Do everything. And the World Health Organization, they particularly stress physical distancing, which is not talked about so much. So you see on television, you often see people on television with the masks on, and then they seem to think that if they've got a mask on, then they're totally protected, and they'll do all the hugging and close-up and everything with everyone, just as if nothing had changed. But if you're wearing a mask, you should also do the physical distancing. It's not a replacement, it's an addition to physical distancing. And only wear the mask if you can't do the physical distancing. And then isolation and quarantine makes a huge difference. With the isolation and quarantine, you stop chains of transmission between yourself and your own household. 80% of transmission is in household, and most people don't realise that the main people you're protecting are the other people in your own household, with supported isolation and quarantine. You can also do your own contact tracing, because this particular disease is spread by talking, most of all by talking at close proximity within a metre for a long time, like 15 minutes. None of this has changed with the new variant. So if you find you've got COVID-19, tell everyone that you've been in contact with for up to 2 days before you first develop symptoms. If you've especially been talking to them for a long period, like 15 minutes or more, within 1 metre. So we can do our own contact tracing. We don't need to wait for the contact tracers to ring us up. And then we've got the vaccines coming along, we've got the face coverings and the hand hygiene. So anyway, that's enough on that. So let's talk about this actual paper, its actual result. So this is Angela Rasmussen, who's someone I follow on Twitter. You're always often saying sensible things and obviously expert. And she said that the data from UK are not particularly convincing. because it didn't take into account a number of unrelated reasons. And I'll talk about those in a minute. And then she says, but the thing is, whether it's more deadly or not, it seems to be more transmissible. They're certainly converging on that. And the main thing is that she says, I don't know if there are any more alarm bells that can be rung to say we have to figure out vaccine rollouts and get vaccine into the arms of people, not only in the US or Canada, but across the globe. So that is the thing that people are coming out and saying about this, that these new variants that end up in the United Kingdom could get here from anywhere in the world. If we don't get rid of the virus, for instance, in the Congo, and a new variant virus in the Congo, it's going to be almost impossible to keep it out of the rest of the world, except by quarantining in isolation, just like New Zealand did. So, short of eliminating it and then quarantining out the rest of the world, then there's going to be no way to keep these new variants out of your country indefinitely. So it's very important for the whole world, for every country. It's important for the United Kingdom that it is eliminated in the entire world. And that includes the countries that are very poor and that have difficulty, they can't actually, from their own side, buy the vaccines. There are many countries that just can't afford to buy vaccines for their population. And that's the reason for the COVAX alliance. And so that's why we all have to be in this together. And so as I say, that doesn't matter whether it's Somalia or the Congo or Brazil or Mexico. We're in this interconnected world. And short of keeping up our quarantine forever, eventually the variants will get into your country. So the physical distancing and all that works now. It stops infections right away. And they can stop all infections that way. You can really reduce your risk as much as really it depends on how thorough you are about doing these measures. The more thorough you are, the lower your risk is. And these can reduce the infections right away, and maybe it's not total reduction, but it's like if you're crossing a road, then there's a risk of being hit by a car. If you look both ways and keep an eye out for the traffic, then your risk of dying in a car accident is hugely reduced, to the point that most people just don't. They just feel very safe. You feel very safe crossing the road because car accidents are very rare, as long as you take care and look both ways. So you can achieve that level of safety with COVID-19 by being careful yourself, with doing the proper physical distancing especially, and the mask wearing, but especially the physical distancing, washing hands, not touching your eyes, nose and mouth. And not to do that is like walking blindly across the traffic and just hoping that nobody hits you, and doing that over and over. So anyway, that's the thing that everyone can do right away, and then with the vaccination, then that adds an extra 10 days. And the vaccines also are not 100%, they are something like 95% or 90%, and it's less. It takes 10 days after the vaccination before it begins to do anything, because it takes that long to build up the antibodies. So the physical distancing works right away. The vaccine has this delay. So we've got this coming along. They're like the cavalry coming along to help us. I've talked about all this before. Yes, just about the new variants. This is the huge complex spike protein and the many different targets that antibodies sort of latch onto to stop the disease. And so the new variants, though, they are going to fade gradually over a period of time. They're expected to evade from the virus. The virus is expected to evade the vaccines over years' timescale or something like that. And the more the virus is spreading now, then the faster it can gradually evade the vaccines. We don't need to worry too much about that, because they can quickly put a new vaccine in place. They can quickly switch the spike on the vaccine on a matter of a time scale of weeks. So now they've proved that the vaccines work, they need to go into how they're going to do that. But that is certainly a possibility if it starts evolving, but we don't, you don't want to have to do that. So COVAX, now there's some really good news from today, is that they are going to start vaccinating. They've got 40 million doses. I'm not sure if it's been done here, in maybe different parts. There we are, 40 million Pfizer doses, and they are going to start vaccinating in the rest of the world, the poorer countries that haven't been able to make these separate agreements. Then they're going to start vaccinating with the Pfizer vaccine, and Pfizer have given their vaccine to, they're supplying their vaccine to COVAX at zero profit, just at cost. So COVAX has a lower price than the other countries that Pfizer are selling their vaccine to. And so COVAX is going to start distributing them via COVAX sometime in early February, and that's very soon now, 40 million doses. They also have 150 million doses of AstraZeneca, and they're all ready to go out. So that's 20 million people, and then another 70 million people, 75 million people. You talk about nearly 100 million people that they're going to be able to vaccinate sometime start vaccinating in February around the world in these weaker economies. And they have enough vaccine available now. That's the 2.97 billion. So I'll just bring up this image. So 2.97 billion doses that they already have secured an option or optional that they can get if they get the funding. And so they've got 2.97 billion. That's apparently enough for 27% of the population. But if you go and look at this figure, then you find that these are the numbers that have already been secured by the wealthy countries. Then that includes that figure as part of it. And so that's 9.3 billion doses. And that is enough for 60% of the world population. With 10 vaccines already approved for use. That's in different countries at different levels of approval. There's only one approved by the World Health Organization so far. These vaccines are very, very safe. Something like 5 million people vaccinated, and they're not getting, they're closely monitoring, and they're not getting any issues with safety from them. So they're very safe vaccines to get. And the reported global vaccine production is 19 billion. This means that if we had the funding available, then we could, and we just were to tie up all the facilities that can make the vaccines, and then all the vaccines, and these are and the vaccines that we want to make all approved, and it looks like every vaccine is getting approved, then we could make enough vaccine in the rest of this year to vaccinate everyone and have some to spare. That's enough for an extra 2 billion people over the world population. We've got enough vaccines for the world population plus an extra 2 billion people. So a lot of spare doses, even though some would be wasted and so on. So it is certainly within reach to vaccinate everyone this year, especially with lots of new vaccines coming on, and some of them are especially easy to make and wouldn't be included in those figures yet. So the situation is looking really very good. And then these secured doses are just explaining enough for 60%, and an awful lot of those are because of the wealthy countries like the UK, like Canada especially, is one of the ones that got several times its own population already secured. You might think, why would they secure so many? And the reason is because when they pre-bought these vaccines, they didn't know that they would all, indeed it was quite surprised that all the vaccines so far are being approved and very effective. I always expected most of the vaccines to be approved because vaccines have a much higher approval rate than other drugs. But it's really great news that they're so effective and that that they've all been approved so far. So it's even higher than previous records for vaccines, which is that nearly all. We expect maybe all except one or two, but it seems like all of them have been approved so far. Of the ones that get to phase 3. And just about all the ones that got to phase 1 got to phase 3. The only one that has been withdrawn so far is an Australian one that, and it was for a very strange reason, that it created antibodies that confused tests for AIDS. So the vaccine didn't cause AIDS. It triggered the antibodies for AIDS. In other words, vaccinating with COVID-19 would, rather bizarrely, also give you a little bit of protection against AIDS as an accidental side effect. But it meant that if you tested for this, then you would find the antibodies of AIDS, and so you get false tests that people would think they had AIDS when they hadn't. So anyway, so that vaccine was withdrawn for that reason. Because it gave you a little bit of protection against AIDS. It's a rather strange reason for withdrawing a vaccine, but sadly that's the way it went. Anyway, so that's it. What else do I need to talk about? Not much. I'll try to keep this to 20 minutes. Oh yes, the limitations of results. I've totally forgotten where I was starting from. Okay, so let's talk about limitations of the results. So first of all, the result was that if you have about 10 deaths per 1,000 cases age 60, that is normal for a healthy 60-year-old. Then if you get it, you've got 1 chance in 100 of dying. And then with the new variant, you would have 13, so 1.3 chance per 100 of dying, 13 per 1,000. But there's some limitations to these results. And here's some of the limitations. Let's bring that up. So first of all, this data was only based on 8% of the cases of COVID-19. That's reason is because only 26% were tested. 26% of all the COVID cases were tested in the pillar 2 test, which is what they needed. Only 30% of those had the data about the S gene, which is what is needed to be able to pick up the new variant. Combine those two together, it means only 8% of the deaths in the UK from COVID were actually tested for the new variant. And then they also found that the excess signal disappeared if you restricted the data they had to people who had a full 28 days of follow-up. So they were finding this signal of an excess of deaths only with partial data rather than the complete data. If you tried to add the extra data, then the signal went away. If you restricted it to just those with the extra data. And so so they had other reasons for thinking they might be a real signal, but it is really not terribly convincing because of all these limitations. And then as well as that, then the another complication was that they are analysing it with different labs, and the labs varied in their sensitivity to the new variant. And then another thing to bear in mind, which they don't mention, is that this dropout of the S gene, then that is something that some variants trigger anyway, that not the new variant. Some of the old variants also have that same signal. So there's a background noise as well for the signal, which is an extra bit of confusion. And if you had none of the new variant at all, you would still, in a region with none of the new variant, you would still get a background noise of old variants, some of which have the same signal, because they're not doing full gene sequencing, they're just using the S dropout, which is an accidental feature that some of the PCR tests have a particular gene that drops out for the new variant. And then another issue with this result is that the higher transmissibility of the new variant could lead to, could be what's leading to the extra deaths, if it means that it preferentially is spreading in particularly vulnerable populations. So it might be, because it's more transmissible, and once it gets into a nursing home, it spreads to more people in the nursing home. And so you get larger super spreader events in particularly vulnerable communities. And so for that to be a signal, then it has to preferentially spread in vulnerable communities. So that's easy to understand for elderly people. It's not so easy to understand why it should preferentially spread amongst vulnerable young people. So that was there, and they saw it for all age ranges. So that's why they think that this, if it weren't for that, they wouldn't have much of a result. But they found that it's doesn't seem to, that you've got the same excess in young people as in old people, and so the higher transmissibility, it's difficult to explain it using a higher transmissibility for the young people. And then, but then on the other limited thing that suggests there might be something wrong with this result is that they would have expected that if you have more deaths, they would expect to see an increase in hospitalization of the variant compared to other variants, and they don't see that. So there's some kind of conflict in their data that it's not really quite meshing together properly yet. So you can see from that why there's some skepticism about this at this stage. They need another few weeks of data to fill in some of those gaps in their analysis before they will begin to have a really convincing result. And now there's another thing that I just want to say. It's a little bit surprising if a coronavirus would become more deadly. It's a little bit surprising. It's not impossible. But the thing is that there are three new coronaviruses that recently jumped over to humans: SARS, MERS, and COVID. And if you look at SARS and MERS, then if it weren't for modern medicine, they would have eventually spread through the population. It's only with modern medicine that we've stopped SARS and MERS. So, especially SARS would certainly have got everywhere without modern medicine. And MERS is also could well have eventually spread or evolved to become more transmissible and eventually got everywhere too. So those are very deadly. SARS and MERS are more deadly than COVID. COVID is slightly less deadly, and it is probably because COVID is a bit less deadly that it is spread so far, because so many countries haven't taken it seriously in the way that they did with SARS and MERS. It's also more transmissible than SARS, but it's also because it's less deadly and people haven't been so careful with it. So that is also a factor for how it spread. But neither of those would make any difference if you go back a few centuries ago, when they would have had no way of stopping it. Indeed, even in the early 20th century, they wouldn't have been able to. So it's quite striking that these three new coronaviruses are so deadly, but the 4 coronaviruses we have already, so there are 16 different cold viruses, and 4 of those are coronaviruses, and none of those are serious. They're all very mild diseases. You'd have to be pretty sick already for something else to be killed by a cold. So this suggests that the end state of evolution of a coronavirus is likely to be very mild. So this depends on the disease. So for instance, polio, smallpox, some diseases, measles, they are really quite deadly, and they've been around for centuries and centuries, and you can go back and find that these have always been deadly. So it's not always, it depends on the disease and how it transmits as to whether it is disadvantage to the disease to kill people. But it seems from the way that colds have evolved, it must be a disadvantage for a cold to kill people, because they've evolved to be milder and milder and milder, even more so than flu. So it seems very likely that for coronavirus, it seems it must be that it's a disadvantage for coronavirus when it's spreading to kill the people it spreads to. It seems very likely. And if that's true, and the end result of evolution should be that it becomes less and less deadly. This is not 100%. This is just a kind of, just that it seems a kind of plausibility argument, quite a good one, but it's not certainty, of course. And then we have a particular example of a coronavirus called OC43, and this is one of the 4 coronaviruses, a quarter of the 16 human common cold viruses, and this has a very close resemblance to bovine coronavirus, BCOV, and it's so close by molecular clock dating, that's looking at how quickly it evolves, the OC43, which is a cold. And you can look at samples of this cold 10 years ago and modern samples and see how much it has changed. Then if you go back and back, it looks like it jumped to humans sometime in the 19th century. So that's really quite a recent crossover from cows to humans, from cattle to humans. And there's a bit of detective work. There was a big pandemic in 1890, which is just the time at the centre of their time of where they think it could have crossed over to humans. That pandemic was rather an unusual one. It had symptoms on the nervous system which are not like that for flu. So it's some people from that pandemic, so back when there were still people alive who'd lived through that pandemic, then they did have H2N2 flu antibodies. But that is not a very watertight argument, because it doesn't necessarily mean they got H2N2 flu in that particular pandemic. We would just got it at any time between that pandemic and when they were tested. So so there's some weak evidence that maybe it was an H2N2 flu, but it just fits the other data so well, because there was a cull of cattle just before that pandemic, and at the time of the pandemic, because of a disease which, looking back, had a very close resemblance to bovine coronavirus, so may have been bovine coronavirus. So it might have been that they were culling cattle with bovine coronavirus, and then it could have jumped to humans as a result of the cull. And it's just the right timing for that pandemic in 1890, which also has these nervous symptoms and nervous system symptoms, and also OC43 has a affinity for the nervous system. So it all fits together, but that doesn't mean it's true, because you sometimes get these patterns that seem to all fit together, but they're actually wrong. So it's a very neat fitting together of things. So it's either quite a nice coincidence, but it's actually wrong, or it could be that it actually was, that actually was when OC43 jumped over to humans. So sadly, there's just no way, we don't have any samples from that time to test either the cattle or the humans. We've got nothing that survives from that time that we can test to test this hypothesis. But if that was indeed OC43, then that would suggest that it was really quite deadly in 1889 to 1890, and then very rapidly became very mild. And so otherwise it's a flu pandemic, which we know that happens with those, but it's not known for coronavirus pandemics, because it's the first one we've had. And MERS and SARS just haven't been circulating enough amongst enough people to have this level of evolution. But then if that was the case, so that is just suggestive. But it could mean that if COVID-19 will eventually, through these variants, eventually evolve to be as harmless as a cold in a few years. But we can't rely on that, and we've got too much time between now and when that would happen for that to be a way to proceed. To just say, well, we'll let it go through the population and lots of us will die like they did in the 1890 pandemic, and then eventually after a couple of years maybe it'll settle down and become like a cold. And so we can't do that. It's far, far too deadly for that. And so, but it is quite promising that it means we're taming it with vaccines, and we're taming it with new therapeutics and methods of treatment. So there are two possibilities. It could be that we get rid of it, and it could be that we tame it to the extent that it's no worse than flu, or even that it by itself varies and becomes like another coronavirus cold. And so the relevance of this particular new variant is that it's a little bit surprising this new variant became more deadly. But then it could do, because even if it's like if you've got a craft that's going down like that, you'd expect eventually to become less deadly, maybe as quickly as a couple of years or so, just a few years, 2, 3, 4 years or something. But it could have, it could, if you had to say this is deadliness and this is time, it could go like that, jiggle around like that, and eventually over time end up being just like a common cold. But over that period of time, you get little spikes when it gets more deadly and less, and more and death. So this is just to say it's a little bit surprising. You sort of expect the new variants to become less deadly, if anything, but it's not impossible that it gets more deadly. And so this result is not impossible, but there's a lot of skepticism about it so far. And then, so there are two ways that it can end up. It can either end up, we can either end this pandemic or we tame it. We've got lots of good therapeutics coming along. We've got the vaccine, and if we get nearly everyone vaccinated, that by itself will hugely reduce the deaths, but it doesn't reduce it enough to be kind of safe. You've still got too many people die, even if we don't know. We don't know. Actually, that's the thing we don't know, sorry. If we can manage to get everyone vaccinated, they just don't know the effect on deaths yet. They know the effect on symptomatic disease, that your risk of a symptomatic disease is reduced 10 or 20-fold. Your risk of severe disease is significantly reduced, at maybe similar level. And so far, they've only got one death, which was AstraZeneca in the placebo group of all the trials, of the 3 trials of Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca. And based on that, you can't really deduce much about what it does to deaths. It could even randomly, if there are deaths in the vaccinated group, then it could randomly be just one death in those. You just can't tell anything from a single death. Very sad that happens, but that's the situation. And so if you do hear eventually a few weeks in the future that someone has died who was vaccinated, then remember that's always been a possibility. We know that it greatly reduces your risk of the severe disease, very much reduces your risk of symptoms. They don't know about deaths, but it's surely extremely likely that it hugely reduces your risk of dying. It's not impossible that the vaccine pretty much eliminates the risk of dying, but they don't know that yet. If it does, then everyone gets vaccinated, then you know you're not going to die, and then what's the risk of long COVID? And if it reduces that as well, then vaccination on its own would hugely tame this disease, but we don't know that. And then vaccination will stop the transmission to some extent. We know that already from AstraZeneca results, but we don't yet know by how much. If the vaccination stops transmission very well, then we can eradicate it just through vaccination. And then, but the quickest way to eradicate it is to do everything. And so that's like with New Zealand managed to eradicate it without a vaccine. And that's the idea of the vaccine filling in gaps in your armour, filling in the holes in your armour. We've got these. If we did a very good health response like New Zealand is doing, and like Biden is trying to do in the United States. So I think it's not impossible that Biden eliminates it in the United States. Eventually, if he keeps on going and gets the R0, keeps the R0 below 1, if you can get everyone doing the masking properly, if he can follow what New Zealand did, he can eliminate it. I think there's no doubt about that. The main question is whether enough Americans have complied, but it's a very similar group of people, physically, a very similar culture to New Zealand, far more similar than the similarity between the United States and Asian cultures. And so I think it's really quite likely, especially Chinese as well, but it's not just Chinese. South Korea is a different kind of culture. It's Confucian inspired, and even though it's a democracy, and Taiwan, it's a different kind of culture again. And so if people wonder if there is a cultural difference that makes it more easier for those countries. New Zealand kind of really blew a hole through all that and showed that Western style democracy with a similar kind of culture to the United States can eliminate this disease, and there's no doubt at all that the United Kingdom could have eliminated it last summer, or indeed even earlier on in the March if they followed the example of same approach as New Zealand. And so with the addition of a vaccine on top of that, and if we can learn as much as possible as we can from the countries that have succeeded, then we can eliminate it. And even if it can get as mild as a cold, then who would want to have a cold if you could eliminate it and have no possibility of that particular cold? So the eliminating it, and remember there's been an awful lot of evolution before it gets as mild as a cold, if it ever does get that far. But the best thing by far is to get rid of this thing. And this is well within reach with the addition of these such excellent vaccines along with what we already have. So anyway, I'll upload this, and hopefully this helps you get a better perspective on what's happening. And the World Health Organization, they're still very positive about this. The vaccines make a huge difference, and they can see that we're going to, with health, we already know how to eliminate this. We have known how to eliminate this since January. And then the vaccine adds extra material onto this. We just have to follow the science, keep the R0 down, keep the R0 down, keep it on down with it when you get down to very few cases, and step up your efforts once you've only got, say, 5 cases in your country. And it's so easy to say, oh, we're just about over it, and then relax, and then before you know it, you've got 100 people infected, and then 1,000, and then 10,000, and then it's way off in another epidemic. So once you go down to 5 cases, go on down to none, and then keep down at none for an extra 2 quarantine periods, so an entire month. That's 0. And then you can let up. That's what New Zealand did. And that is what we should be doing. Anyway, so I'll upload this. Just a reminder, do like and subscribe to my channel, and telling you about the Doomsday Debunk group on Facebook, where we welcome fact checkers and people who, as well as the scared people, and do read the rules at the head of the group before you post or comment, because they help it to run smoothly.